Scarface. That is one classic poster, by the way. 1983 crime film directed by Brian De Palma, starring Al Pacino, Michelle Pfeiffer, and F. Murray Abraham. It actually is a remake of an old movie from the 1930s, centering around the rise and fall of an immigrant mobster in Chicago. This version modernized it so as to set it around the Cuban refugee crisis and moved the story to Miami. Tony Montana, played by Al Pacino, arrives in Florida along with thousands of other prisoners released by Fidel Castro. Unhappy with a dead-end job at a food truck, he quickly turns back to a life of crime, becoming initially an errand boy for a crime boss, Frank Lopez, and then gradually moving up in the organization, eventually accumulating all the power for himself. So, believe it or not, I've never actually seen the film before. I, of course, roughly knew the story. I knew it was one of Pacino's more recognizable roles. I knew some of the quotes and individual scenes, but I never got around to watching it in its entirety, until now. The first thing that scared me a little bit was the runtime. Scarface is 2 hours 50 minutes long, which is a lot. Thankfully, its pacing and engaging storyline mean that it's not a problem at all. It's one of those longer movies where you don't really notice the passage of time. Second, as a boy that grew up playing various video games, among them GTA Vice City, I knew that this particular game was somewhat inspired by Scarface, but only by watching the film I got to appreciate just how much of it was straight up ripped and stolen. Some of the locations, especially the hotel where the drug exchange scene takes place, the street along Miami Beach, the nightclub, Tony's mansion, they are one-to-one copies from the film into the game. That honestly made the movie a lot more fun for me because it felt familiar from the get-go. Because I've spent so much time in the game, I now felt like I knew where I was half the time. Which honestly helps if you're watching a story with a protagonist as unlikable as Tony Montana. I mean, this is by no means a romanticized take on crime. It's a pretty straightforward condemnation of this part of society. Most of the people Tony interacts with are scumbags, remorseless evil types, but Tony himself is perhaps the worst of them all. Anger issues, lack of self-control, violent tendencies, greed, drug abuse, overconfidence, arrogance, and pride, treats objects like women. I mean, the guy is pretty clearly meant to be a villain protagonist. The way the story moves also helps make all of his flaws and vices extremely clear. Even as he's climbing the ranks, while you do have short moments where you want to cheer for him, you also get that sense that he is getting ahead of himself all the time. There's a scene towards the beginning of the film where Frank warns Tony and gives him several rules to be successful in the drug dealing business. And if you pay attention over the course of the film, Tony breaks every single one of those rules. He never follows good advice. Part of the character's consistency in all of this is of course good writing, but another thing is Pacino's performance. I initially thought he was a weird choice for a Cuban immigrant, but when I got used to the accent, I actually bought him. I think he does disappear into the persona of Tony and stays believable as the character throughout. He sells all of the vile sides of him, especially that impression that he's like a caged, rabid animal ready to bite at any moment without consideration for the consequences. So his eventual downfall is absolutely inevitable, and when it does come, you do have a tinge of sadness because you've spent almost 3 hours with the character, but you also know that there could be no other ending to this story, that it feels appropriate and justified and right what happens. Which makes it even weirder to me that to this day there are people on the internet who seem to idolize the character of Tony Montana and put him on some sort of pedestal as this idealized bad boy with an attitude to look up to. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you consider Tony Montana sympathetic, I think, and think he's an example in any way whatsoever in life, you probably haven't been paying attention to the film's message. One last piece of trivia that I have related to the movie's release, which was quite funny, it has to do with the amount of profanity and violence that it has. The film has over 200 instances of the word fuck being said, which I think was the most in any movie ever at the time of its release. When Brian De Palma submitted its initial cut to the American rating agency, the MPAA, they rated it as X, which would pretty much kill any attempt at a wide theatrical release. So he cut some scenes, toned it down, resubmitted, X again. He cut some more, re-edited some stuff, submitted for the third time, X again. De Palma had enough at this point and refused to change the movie any further. So the producers brought in a panel of experts, including DEA officers who work in the field, to sit down with the MPAA. They explained that the film is pretty lifelike in its depiction of crime, and further on that it does not endorse crime or violence, but instead pretty clearly condemns them. That finally convinced the agency, and they finally gave the third cut an R rating. But that's not the end, because Brian De Palma revealed several months after the fact that he was still convinced that the producers wouldn't even know the difference between the cuts anyway at this point. So he proceeded to just submit the original very first cut as the one to be distributed in theaters and then in the home release. And of course, that's the way it happened. Nobody noticed. So after all the bullshit, we were fortunate enough to experience the director's original vision, which, to this day remains a classic film for good reason. Scarface is an engaging crime film with great story, fantastic character progression, and a memorable performance, especially from Al Pacino. If, like me, you haven't seen it before, be sure to give it a go.